Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dave Troy, who is an investigative journalist focused on exposing threats to democracy. Dave Troy, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Glad to be here, John. Looking forward to it.
Likewise. And but before we get rolling, I just want to give a shout out to a friend of the podcast, Bart Stewart, for recommending Dave be on the Cognitive Crucible. So thank you, Bart. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Dave, will cover threats to democracy and your unfolding ongoing thought leadership on dynamics related to threats to democracy. But before we get into this topic, could we start by getting your overall assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you like, your hot take on the times in which we live?
Yeah, so I think, we are sort of at an unprecedented point of having the information landscape really be manipulated by all sorts of different factors, state actors, non-state actors, companies. And I think that, that's in large part just sort of a byproduct of the growth of things like social media, the consolidation of ownership of media in general. And so, we're I think, in a very kind of fragile moment where a lot of power is concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of people, which means that we may be subject to various kinds of violent swings. And that doesn't always mean that things are going to go poorly, but it means that they may not be quite so predictable. It's kind of like the weather, with more energy in the climate and more concentration of power, we might expect stranger things to happen.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll get into this more, but you bring a perspective to this challenge space that I think our audience will appreciate. So yeah, one of the themes on this podcast is thinking about our world, our society, our culture, competing cultures as complex systems which are interacting with one another in curious ways, nonlinear ways, very difficult to predict ways, but are having an effect. And so anyway, you I think have been looking at this through the perspective of misinformation and disinformation in particular. And there is an article that to our audience, I'll put a link to this article from Dave, but it's called Disinformation and Its Effects on Social Capital Networks. Do you think maybe, Dave, you could just give a quick hit on this article, what it is, and how our audience might take a look at it?
Yeah, sure. So, my background is in kind of two things, really, history and computer science. I'm also an entrepreneur, so I've built some companies in the tech field and kind of have been, in the internet space since it started in the early 90s. So I have a lot of, sort of exposure to the growth of the tech industry and how that's affected the information landscape. And, I also was present at the creation of a lot of the social media landscape. So I've been studying that, really mathematically since that got underway. And so what this paper that you are linking to is really trying to cover is, sort of my conclusions after studying this landscape for several years, and really looking at it as a systems problem. So, you may recall that, starting in like 2015, 2016, 17, there was a big push to, get more aware around topics of like disinformation and misinformation, because it was clear that there was a lot of effort to try to manipulate the information landscape in all kinds of ways, over the last 8, 10 years. So people became very interested in that very narrow little slice of the problem, disinformation. Well, what is disinformation? Disinformation meaning information deployed with the intention of creating a false impression or deceiving or, achieving an outcome. Misinformation, obviously, being also important, people sharing false information, medical information, what have you, and having it go viral. And I started to think about this really from a more systems level perspective of like, what is the meaning of this stuff? Like, how does this function in a broader system to create the kinds of outcomes that we actually care about and the ones that we're worried about? And so I started to think, well, what's the mechanism of action here? It's not, disinformation isn't bad in that it convinces somebody that something is, true that is actually false. And, there's also things that are subjective and or, open to question that aren't so clear cut. And so I was thinking like, well, what does this actually do? What we're really talking about is reconfiguring our social topology in ways that maybe are not beneficial to democracy. So what ends up happening in practice is that when you have disinformation and misinformation employed at scale, it tends to draw people into social groups. And so, for example, Facebook groups or Telegram groups, or, even more broadly, like cults, where people they join these kinds of social networks in hopes of gaining connection and friendship and meaning, really, and belonging. And when people are drawn into these networks for those reasons, it really doesn't matter what the information payload is. Like, people want to join networks of people that give them those feelings of belonging and whatnot. So anyway, what I kind of concluded after a lot of study and a lot of conversations with various kinds of experts is that it is this social reconfiguration that is at the core of what we really need to be paying attention to. And so, sure, you can make the statement that misinformation and disinformation are bad and we should curb them. But, there's also an unfortunate fact, which is that after people have been sort of herded into these social groups, it becomes very difficult to pull them out of them via, just stopping the disinformation or the misinformation, or, giving them truth versus lies or whatever. It just doesn't change anything because people are now drawn into these, social configurations that are very pointed and have a very certain point of view, and they're deriving a lot of value from being connected to each other. So then the question is, well, how do you undo that? Well, you have to figure out some way of undoing that social reconfiguration. And that's a much taller challenge, and one that for the most part we haven't considered. So I have some ideas about how to pursue that, but ultimately that's the challenge. And obviously that's a very different problem from just stopping disinformation or stopping misinformation. So that's really what this paper is aiming to articulate.
Yeah. If I could just try to restate what I heard as the most important part of your response there, is that it's the reconfiguration of society which worries you especially, or which you're trying to shine a light on in particular. Disinformation, misinformation, and the information landscape in general might be part of fueling this reconfiguration, but it's the reconfiguration itself that you're wanting to focus in on. Is that sound about right?
Yes, and I would argue that you could make the case that democracy only works when social configurations are relatively balanced, when people are not drawn too much into weird cultish behaviors. And I actually developed kind of a mathematical definition of a cult as part of this little paper, which is basically any little sub social network for whom it has become so tightly wound up around itself that its local uh, concerns overrides broader societal concerns.
Mm.
And I don't know that anybody's really articulated that in that specific way. I mean, this is sort of getting at the intersection of network science and sociology. But
Mm.
at any rate, um, if you believe that, then this is sort of like a platform. If society is a platform and democracy is software, then there are minimum platform requirements that exist for the democracy software to run. And what I'm concerned with is that we are getting ourselves into societal configurations on top of which democracy is incompatible.
Ah, I see. Have you come across or have you thought about um, the concept of institutions and how institutions play a role in society and how institutions are being affected by these reconfigurations?
Yeah, I actually just wrote my most recent column about that. And I think that, it's institutions are, obviously parts of society that try to engender trust, right? I mean, they kind of
Hmm.
require a certain amount of trust in order to be useful as entities. And so I think one of the challenges that we have right now is not unlike the person to person societal reconfiguration that we have going on. We also have reconfiguration of people's trust relationships with institutions, and other entities. So as a result, we are in many ways potentially rendering some of our institutions dysfunctional and or obsolete by way of or eroding the trust that people might otherwise have in them. So I think that's a big part of this as well. And I talk a little bit about the different kinds of relationships that exist in the fabric of society. You've sort of got the person to person relationships, which, sort of our normal societal relationships, but you also have parasocial relationships that exist between people and, thought leaders and celebrities, and then also relationships to institutions. So all of those things play a role.
Hmm. And I'm reminded of two previous podcast episodes that touch on institutions and the importance of institutions. There's two of them. So there's one with a fellow named Jonathan Rausch
Hmm.
discussing his book on the Constitution of Knowledge, and also Yuval Levin, who's a constitutional scholar and institution scholar. And so we'll have links to both of those episodes for those who'd like to check them out a little bit more. In your work in progress paper that we mentioned a few minutes ago, Dave, you have a interesting analogy to a forest fire. Do you think you could like tell that story and how it fits in and
Sure.
you know and by the way, this is something that Bart called out in particular, that he thought that this was a powerful way of looking at the problem.
Yeah, several people have remarked to me that this has been a very helpful and clarifying metaphor. So basically, the idea is that if you think about the social ties that exist sort of normally, organically in society, and you think that okay, these balancing social ties, cross-cutting social ties, sometimes sociologists call them, are if these are the pathways across which information can flow and which supports, let's say, a healthy democracy, and you then take, all of this kinds of information warfare and disinformation, misinformation, social networks, institutional collapse, all of that, and apply it to society, what effect you end up having is you're burning away a lot of social ties that had existed that had made democracy kind of supportable. And in some cases, you are also creating new social ties, but a lot of the new social ties that you're creating are parasocial in nature. They're not, let's say high quality social ties. So maybe somebody gets sucked into a particular news channel or into a particular internet personality's community That's not the same as having social ties to people in your family or in your church or in your, volunteer group or in your government.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're basically doing is replacing a lot of high quality social ties that took a long time to build up.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly in the kind of before COVID times when we were, really kind of existing more in a real world kind of environment than we have been over the last 5 years. So anyway, you take all that high quality social capital, you burn it away, and you replace it with this low quality stuff. And the argument that I would make is that it's just like a forest fire, like if you've ever seen a forest after it's been burned away, it's a big charred mess. Now, there are things that start to come up from that, little wildflowers and, new tree sprouts and pine cones and whatever. But, that takes an incredibly long time to build back. So I think the reason I came up with this analogy was that there was so much emphasis being placed on, fact checking and restoration of truth over fiction and all that kind of stuff. And, sure, we should try to operate in the realm of truth and fact as much as possible. But point being that no amount of truth is going to restore that social capital that's been lost. Like it just isn't going to happen. And in fact, you can yell at people and tell them the truth all you want all day long, and it doesn't restore those social ties that have been lost. If anything, they're now more retrenched into their positions because, as I mentioned earlier, they're getting social connection and belonging and meaning from being part of these, communities of interest. So, truth alone won't fix it. And so we need to treat this more in terms of recovering from this and looking at the future, and also in protecting what we
Mm-hmm.
still want to protect. We need to look at this as a kind of a one-way burning function that really can't be easily reversed. It's not so simple as just fixing, what goes out in the media. We have to look at this as a dynamic system with invisible connections,
Mm-hmm.
for the most part. I mean, we really don't have good ways of seeing all of these social ties that are burned away, but yet we hear anecdotally all the time about people losing family members and, friends because they're blocking them for political reasons. So anyway, that's the analogy, and I think that it does fit. I was speaking with Elizabeth Newman, who is a former Trump administration DHS official last week, and she also remarked that that forest fire analogy was one that she had frequently cited in some of her
Mm-hmm.
work.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it fits, and I think it's the right analogy.
Yeah, so many thoughts cascading from all of that, Dave. The first is the observation that it is so much easier to destroy than it is to create. So much energy and diligence and human thoughtfulness and trial and error goes into building anything, really, building a family, building a building, building a military unit, building a company, building a society, building a Western Enlightenment project. I mean,
Yeah,
there is all kinds of, blood, sweat, and tears that have gone into, this society that we are the beneficiaries of, right? We're all standing on the shoulders of giants and all that kind of stuff. The British. I'm going out of my swim lane here a little bit, but common law, right?
sure.
The common law corpus is so valuable because it represents compromise and decision making and justice that has been assembled over many hundreds of years, and yet
Hmm.
it is so easy to take a match to it all and just burn it to the ground. I'm being hyperbolic, but
No, but
uh,
I think you make a good point, and we are in a lot of ways allowing a lot of that stuff to happen. Sometimes in the name of things that we want to value. Free speech, for example, is can cut a lot of different directions, and I think we all want to have free speech, but that doesn't mean we should have unrestricted information warfare either.
right, yep, for sure. So you in a previous response, Dave, you talked about how, is the society that we are living in today, which is being affected by today's information environment, is that society conducive to democracy as we've, come to know it? And that's a really good question. And the set of circumstances that people grow up in dramatically affects the way they perceive the world. And I was just thinking about this the other day. So, like, if our audience could like consider, growing up in like an agricultural society or a hunter gatherer society, hundreds or thousands of years ago, like literally that, you're living that lifestyle every single day where you wake up and you don't know where your next meal is coming from. And your whole life, every single day of your life is like find the next calorie, right? That's what we do. That's what me and my family and my small clan do is we wake up, we go hunting, we scratch the ground for grain, and we are looking for calories to survive, right? That is a very different life than what we enjoy today, and it begets a whole different way of looking at the world, the kinds of gods that you pray to, the kinds of the ways you interact with people, strangers who you encounter. So your question is a really good one, Dave. If these institutional connections that we've grown accustomed to, say over the last, just like maybe the last 100 years, if those societal cultural connections have been singed or burned away or like altered in ways that we have a hard time comprehending, what does that do to the day-to-day existence of today's children and the world that they're growing up in, uh, which includes these devices, which are essentially you know the internet in their pocket and access to instantaneous information, all that kind of stuff. How does that affect the way they are perceiving the world, and is it conducive to democracy? So there's a
Just a few
question.
thoughts there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a question in there somewhere. So please
No, I get
forgive my
what you're
rambling. Yeah.
I get what you're pointing towards, and I think that there are some peculiarities, let's say, of the American context that are worth calling out separately from kind of how this analysis might apply to a broader global context. And I do think it applies globally. I think this is kind of a universal formulation for kind of how this stuff might work. But I think the American context is quite a special case in some ways. And the reason for that, in part, has to do with America's peculiar backstory and geography as well.
Mm.
So if you think about the fact that, this is a very large country that's mostly empty, from a
Yeah.
practical standpoint, there's just not that many people that live here relative to the amount of space it takes up. And the people that, the large concentrations of population tend to be in the cities. We have this kind of urban-rural divide that is, I think we mostly don't really acknowledge it that much because we tend to think about things in terms of states and maybe East Coast versus West Coast, those sorts of things. But, at the end of the day, the difference between urban and rural worldviews is really quite stark. So I did a little quantitative study back in, I guess it was 2012 initially is when I first ran it. And it showed that you could predict voting behavior in the presidential race as a function of population density in a given county. So, and what I found, and to my knowledge, this study was pretty original, and I'm still kind of credited as like the guy that figured this out. Um, if there's greater than like 1,000 people per square mile, the odds are that folks would vote Democrat. If it's below that, odds are folks would vote Republican. It tended to be about a 66% correlation when you kind of filtered out the noise. And so, what you kind of can learn from that is that there are really two different worldviews that, like, so it's kind of a bimodal distribution of worldviews in effect. So in our rural areas, we tend to have a kind of a, Republican, conservative, hands off my land kind of approach to things, pro guns, et cetera. And then in cities, it tends to be more, I guess, left leaning liberal, more interested in, immigrant issues and things like that. But point being, two very different worldviews. If you look at the interface between urban and rural, that's really the suburban landscape. And that's really where the battleground has been for elections in our country for a long time. So without getting, too into the weeds of election analysis, that's where if a Republican or a Democrat is going to win, it's going to be in a battle over the suburbs for the most part. And so point of all that is to say that when you start to screw with the social fabric of the country, the most vulnerable place that you could go would be to that interface between urban and rural, not to mention the interface between race and wealth and all the other sort of divisions that exist. But, as we manipulate these social ties, those are the areas where you can really get us into a situation where we have what amount to irreconcilable differences. And that bimodal distribution not only becomes prominent, but maybe permanent. And to the extent that we have, and, it doesn't take a lot of, imagination or research to look at situations in this country where that bimodal distribution has been a problem. There was that whole unpleasantness in 1860, this is right on the surface of American history and culture. And I think anybody that's observing this from an external perspective that wants to have an impact on how this country functions needs not look any further than exacerbating those divisions and making them worse. and so that's what a lot has been happening with these external information warfare players and some domestic ones. And some people have a legitimate desire to take us to a civil war. And to the extent that they want to do that, and to the extent that's possible, it might happen. So anyway, yeah, I think that's kind of the issue here, is that we could actually get ourselves into a situation where the democracy that we are, that we've been using is not compatible with the society that we have.
Yeah. In using complex systems terminology, there's like signals and boundaries. Complex systems have boundaries, and they're difficult to define, but there are contours that describe society and culture and institutions. And I think you were just describing like a systems between like urban and rural systems interacting with one another and finding those boundaries. Boundaries are where there is potential weakness or potential access to systems there on the frontier between an urban system and a rural system. I agree. Enemies of the West or enemies of democracy are finding these seams and gaps and fissures in our social discourse, and basically just pouring gas right into those areas of vulnerability in order to foment additional distrust, discord, etc.
Yeah, all with the goal of testing the limits, like you said, the boundaries. At what point does our democracy fail? And we've already, been feeling out those edges, obviously, over the last few years. And the more that we play in this realm, the more we're likely to, find ourselves in a position where it might not be recoverable.
Right. I'm curious if you've ever thought about this. So another conversation that we had a couple of years ago with a researcher, his name is Sean McFate. I believe I have that right. It's either Fate or McFate. I think it's McFate. We'll have a link in the show notes. But he's written a lot about the changing nature of war and conflict and things along these lines. this Westphalian system of states model that the West in particular, well, it's a global model currently. But it was only established what in the 1600s or
Yeah.
thereabouts, and so it's a relatively recent phenomenon of having countries and boundaries and governments and all this kind of stuff. But just because it's been around for a couple of hundred years, it's it's an anomaly when you look at the long arc of human history where it was more boundaryless and tribal and marauding bands of people just sweeping the countryside doing bad things to people that they encounter. um, uh, uh, I'm wondering if there is like some kind of like a cyber kind of model forming, cyber allegiances. Like, I mean, can you imagine someday, Dave, instead of geographic countries, you have like cyber defined countries?
Oh, there's people actively working on that.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, there's a
Tell me more about
fellow
that.
out of Silicon Valley who's a little bit of an extremist. I don't support his views on this, but I've been to his conference about it because I wanted to understand it. Balaji Srinivasan, who's a Silicon Valley venture capitalist guy,
Okay.
has been pushing a scheme that he calls the network state. That basically is the idea that you shouldn't necessarily be tied down to some geography. The state that you belong to shouldn't necessarily be an accident of your birth and all of this sort of thing. So he has this idea that people should be able to join the network state, which has its own rules and has its own arrangements for dealing with any taxes that might be due. Although a big part of this is tax revolt, and it's led in part by Patry Friedman, who was Milton Friedman's grandson, and he was the guy that came up with a lot of the ideas behind seasteading, the idea of sort of going out and developing lands out on the open seas that were free of any kind of sovereign, connections to other countries and their tax systems. Because again, a lot of this is about taxes. But at any rate, yeah, no, I mean, you make a really good point about kind of the Westphalian system and kind of where we're at. And for those that aren't familiar, the Westphalian state system, was, as you said, implemented in the mid 1600s with the idea that there are countries and countries have boundaries, and within those boundaries that those countries are sovereign and they have rules, and legislatures and or other governmental systems that determine the way that that country works, and no other country can tell another country what to do, and the only sort in that context, the only sort of like mechanism for dispute resolution is war. Practically speaking, I mean, you can also have trade competition and various kinds of trade warfare, things like that. But point being that we've been living with that as the premise for like the last 500 years ish, 400 years, and maybe that system needs some tuning. And obviously we've had various episodes over the last 100 years that have been less than great. World War One was obviously a lot of things coming to a boil, and then they implemented Woodrow Wilson and others implemented the League of Nations with the idea that that would help to stave off future wars. And all during the 1930s, the red alarms were blinking on the League of Nations, and people were saying this is not going to fix the problem. And then, of course, we had World War II. And then what did we do with, after World War II? We implemented the United Nations, which is basically recapitulating most of the errors of the League of Nations. And it, too, is failing to provide a lot of value in a contentious global situation that we have now. So I would argue that we are living effectively with many of the same kind of vulnerabilities that we lived with in 1939, and that we need to be thinking more about what a global, sort of vision for democracy is going forward, that makes democracy not only, sort of the I guess, the morally appealing choice, but also the practically workable choice, the one that wins. Because right now, we're up against various authoritarians and autocratic rulers who are becoming increasingly networked. We've seen Putin gaining a much more closeness with Xi and with Kim Jong Un and with Vietnam, and so you have these countries that are becoming much more networked in opposition to the democratic West, and we're just kind of sitting here going, well, ours is better. Why aren't you doing it our way? And unfortunately, that's not a terribly compelling argument, and it also doesn't look like it's necessarily going to win.
Hmm.
So I feel like we need to work on that.
Well, so continuing along those lines, what are some of your suggestions or observations about the future of democracy globally, or and how to drive forward a positive vision?
Well, so I guess in good news, this is not the first time people have thought about this. There have been other people that have been thinking about this over the course of the last 100 years. And one guy in particular, named Clarence Streit, he was a New York Times correspondent who had been sent to Geneva to cover the League of Nations during the 1930s. And as he was there, he realized that the League of Nations was never going to work out, partly because of just nationalism. The members of the League of Nations are nations. And what he realized in that context was that, A, it's not very democratic because you have really big nations that, are members as well as very small ones, and there's really no mechanism for balancing out their power concerns. So, just like you have now with the UN and the Security Council, with, Putin having a veto over everything, that's kind of crazy. Um, so he recognized that kind of a structural flaw. And what he proposed was the idea of putting together the world's 15 biggest democracies. And he picked 15 because, it was a handy number and he could identify which countries those might be off the top of his head. But he basically said, take the world's 15 biggest democracies and put them into a union that would function in the same way that the Union of the American States functioned when we formed the Constitution. And that was formed with very specific reasons in mind to get rid of trade imbalances and other problems that were existing between the colonies. And it was a really interesting idea. It gained actually a great deal of support, but then World War II happened and everybody kind of forgot about it. Now, I'm not saying that Clarence Streit had the ultimate answer here, but we haven't really talked about things in those terms in any kind of serious societal way since World War II, since the formation of the UN. And we've tended towards thinking that the UN is somehow or another a good answer in this, broader puzzle that we face. And I would argue that I mean, the UN is a thing. I just don't think we should over venerate it. And I don't know that it is the answer for where we need to go. So what I'm calling for, and in fact, I'm launching a little bit of an event series around this, is, a broader conversation about what the future of democracy should look like. And, we could start with maybe Clarence Streit's ideas because they're pretty clear and they're easy to understand, but they're not the only ideas that we might explore. And I think it's time that we put that out there because otherwise I think the bad guys, and I have no qualms in saying that I think that the authoritarians and autocrats are the bad guys. I think that they're going to gain ground, and I think it's going to be a problem for the democratic West.
Right. You're talking about putting together, did you say a conference series on
Yeah, just a
this?
very small kind of working group on this topic. So if
Hmm.
folks listening know people that are well studied on this and want to be involved, we're going to be kicking something off later this year in Washington. But it's the idea of trying to amplify some of these voices, trying to find people who are thinking about these broader global problems in a way that's compatible with democratic values. Because as I mentioned, Balaji Srinivasan, he's thinking about this, but it's really not democratic. He's got a much more, I mean, I don't want to say fascist authoritarian mindset, but it kind of is. It's something that we need to counter with better ideas.
Right. Yeah, I was actually just looking that up. You said that there was a conference, the Network State
Yeah, it was in
Conference.
Amsterdam back in last October. I went to it.
Yeah,
It was very interesting.
Yeah, it looks like this year that same conference series is going to be in Singapore in
That sounds
September.
right. Yeah.
I'll put a link in the episode notes for that. And also he has a book called The Network State,
Yeah.
how to start a new country. Um, with a whole bunch of good reviews. They're on
Well,
Amazon.
I'm sure, yeah, the people that are
Sure,
into this
sure.
stuff are pretty cultish about it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's bias and everything, but my point is, it's not, it hasn't been reviewed just a couple of times. It's like, 500 ratings.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
It's
There's a
got a,
following there.
yeah, there's an
And what's
audience.
it is worth pointing out too that those ideas that he's talking about, as I mentioned, Patrick Friedman's involved in that, and they're really the third generation of people that have kind of articulated those kinds of ideas. There's another book that I would recommend to people called
Yeah,
Adventure Capitalism by Raymond Crabe, who is a historian professor out of Cornell. And I actually had a podcast. I did a podcast episode with him that you could include a link to if you want. But
yeah.
basically, in the 20th century, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there were people pursuing these same ideas. Now, granted, without the internet, but very much the idea of what people would call libertarian exit, of kind of trying to escape from all of the oppression of the government wanting you to pay taxes and going off and doing something else. So setting up colonies on islands and
Hmm.
trying to negotiate to set up their own little sovereign states. This goes back a long ways.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Dave. Kind of wrapping up here, and I don't remember if I said this or not, but we are recording this on June 25th, 2024. And so we are, right in the middle of the United States election, presidential election, plus, congressional elections as well. So what are some things that are on your mind, and how do you nest this conversation into the here and now with respect to what's going on in the United States?
Yeah, so I mean, we have our big election here, obviously, and as you said, federal, state, local, and then there's several big elections happening around the world as well. And so I think the thing that people probably should at least reflect on is the idea that we really don't know, what the factors that might shape the election might be over the course of the next few months. For example, we've got a debate coming up on Thursday. Either one of our elderly presidential candidates could do something that doesn't play well in the realm of information landscape and causes them trouble. And so, we need to be on the lookout for that. But that's kind of small potatoes compared to some of the larger things that might happen. I was, speaking with somebody last week, a former government official who confided that they were very concerned about the possibility of a terrorist attack in the United States over the next few months. And it could potentially be from somebody coming across the border. And like that would be terrible because A, nobody wants a terrorist attack, but also the implications within the information landscape would be quite potentially damaging because at the end of the day, if it turns out that there's a terrorist attack, and if it turns out that those people that caused it came across the southern border, then that is going to end up being a real big issue for Biden, whether it's his fault or not. Like you can get into arguments over the reality of that, but point being, that's a very effective way of altering the information landscape if somebody wanted to pursue it. And there's thousands of other things like that could come out of nowhere. Deus ex machina events anywhere in the world that could shape the information landscape in ways that are completely unpredictable now. So I think one of the things that I think we should kind of take to heart is the idea that we cannot predict the future. And that, as much as political pundits might want to, you know, prognosticate and make guesses about what factors and what certain VP pick or whatever might make a difference. At the end of the day, you can't outguess uncertainty. You just don't know what is going to happen. So I feel like to the extent that the incentives for scrambling the playing field are so high right now, it's well worth just considering that we don't really know what's going to happen over the course of the next few months, which means we should be prepared for practically anything. And that if you are a person of political convictions and wants to protect your candidate's stance, find ways to start worrying about contingencies, because contingencies are the things that are going to probably shape the outcomes. So anyway, just some thoughts to consider.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, Dave, Troy, you've really given us a lot to think about, and these are obviously not solved problems, but are going to be enduring. Way back up to the top of this podcast, I haven't mentioned this in a while, but I really do like this framing. One of the founding board members of IPA, a gentleman named Dr. Rand Waltzman. But he came up with a little turn of phrase that I really appreciate along these lines, is that, this informational problem that we live in could be considered like a chronic disease, in that there is no cure for it, right? But it may be managed. And
Yeah.
so that I think, I'm glad to hear you say, yeah, that I mean, there's something to that, this is something that requires, vigilance and diligence and consistent, TLC in order to keep the lights on. And so anyway,
Well, I just want to second that. I've met Rand, and
oh, you
I've
have,
followed
you
some.
have,
Yeah, I've met
yeah.
follow some of his work, and I really think that that's a good analogy to it. And to the extent that I was saying, we may end up with a societal configuration that doesn't support democracy well. It's really our job. It's kind of like health, like you got to go to the doctor, you got to get your blood tests, you got to manage what you eat and your exercise and all of that in order to stay healthy enough to do the things you need to do. The same is true of our democracy. And the more that I think that people wake up to the idea that societal health is actually important for all of us in order to ensure our survival, then I think that we might get more into collectively managing that societal health to make sure that it functions, for the purposes of democracy. Because I think it's going to become increasingly clear that if we, keep eating junk food and doing terrible things, our societal health will not support democracy, and that's not going to be a good moment. So I think that's a
Yeah.
great analogy.
Yeah. All right. With that, Dave Troy, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John. Really enjoyed the conversation.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.